go. Hello, testing. Workshop 10, everybody. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Lighting and global illumination, as we call it in Unreal. You don't need to see the hello world, you need to see this. Cool. So, huge topic in Unreal, and quite frankly, one of the main reasons why I personally use Unreal is the advanced lighting techniques it has over other 3D software, and it's absolutely amazing the qualities you can achieve with Unreal's, especially Unreal's new global illumination method, which was introduced in Unreal Engine 5, called Lumen. So I'll share, like always, all the documentation and stuff that we'll go through, plus some videos, because there really are depths to this global illumination and reflections methods, which, to be quite frank, will be the balance of your performance on your machines versus the gameplay output. So we'll be covering some baked lighting techniques versus some dynamic real-time lighting techniques. We'll cover some environment lights in the scene like we have in our current landscape. So we'll talk about the directional light, the clouds, the sky atmosphere, skylights, and post-process volumes and clouds. And we'll also have a look at some lighting tools and plugins, which I found very useful over the course of using Unreal Engine, especially for performance. If you're packaging games, or not so much a concern for renders per se, but much more for packaging games, lighting and reflections will be the ones that will cost you the most frames per second. So we can opt to go for and I'll share some feedback, whether we go for baked lighting or dynamic lighting only, depending on our scenarios, whether we can use a combination of lighting. So here, this red thread goes on a little bit about how you can use a bit of both to optimize your performance. So in your scene, in your game, let's say you might have some static objects, some objects that don't move, and you want that lighting and those shadows to be baked, but you also want maybe the sun direction throughout the day. If you're changing the sun direction in your game or your architecture visualization, whatever it may be, you might want to enable like dynamic shadows, so that you have partial baked shadows, but when the sun moves, it can also affect some of the static objects in the scene as well. So there's a lot of layers to this. But going back to the tools, like I said, we'll explore the lighting, the default environment lighting in Unreal. HDRI backdrops and visualization tools is something very, very handy. This is basically another way to light your scene without using the global illumination, Lumen as global illumination. And this basically takes a 360 image of an environment, top and bottom as well, merges it into a sphere called an HDRI, and that could be used in your environment to also give you a bit of context of the landscape, but it can also be used to light your scene at the same time. So I'll share that stuff so you can have a dive into that as well. And if you're doing more accurate representation, so let's say if you're doing architectural visualizations, or your game is based in Korea and you want to put a direct sort of pinpoint location to match the exact lighting, the time of the month, the time of the day, to what it would mean like to be in Korea at that time of the year, let's say, you can add that all into the engine as well. It can accommodate latitude and longitude coordinates, and you can play with those parameters as well. So this could be quite cool for primarily I use this for architectural visualizations in Cyprus, where it's very, very useful to get accurate representations of the sun direction and where it is at 6 in the morning versus 10 at night. So that's quite cool. Bit of which came there. And like I said, yeah, environment lights, which I've shown you previously in the engine. And skylights will go a bit later on as we use it. And like I said, I'll share, there's some pretty cool explainer videos on global illumination and Unreal Engine 5, going over reflections. There's a lot of videos that have been coming up about this recently. Now, pursue with caution. It is a bit of an artistic form. It is also still a very experimental lumen. So hence why not a lot of production and game studios have adopted to it yet. But like I said, proceed with caution. If you're doing real-time stuff, it's quite cool, it's quite easy to use. If you're going for a baked lighting approach and more AR games or games development in general, you might look to avoid it currently. Again, if you can get deep dive into it and break it and make it, feel free to use it. But like I said, it is a bit experimental at the moment, so cautious about it. Right, there's a quick little rant and introduction. Any questions till here? I guess some concepts that we haven't really mentioned before. So what do I mean by baked lighting versus dynamic lighting? Baked lighting will allow you to take everything into the scene into consideration, the lights, the shadows, everything that we have, and compress it into a file that Unreal calls a light map. And light map is basically a file. It's basically a UVs. It's the same file as a UV file if you've seen one of those before when you do 3D modeling, but essentially it's got the lighting textures baked onto the UVs as well. So it generates a file set, but then at that instance, it's something that you do at the very end. It's something you continue to test as you develop, but it's something that you do much at the end of the pipeline, because if you bake your scene, and that process can take quite a long time for landscapes and big environments, not so much for interior spaces, but yeah, big for landscapes and foliage. I guess we'll show it as we move along. Yes, and dynamic lighting, like I said, if you have a powerful enough computer and you're not necessarily packaging for any game, and you want to use the game engine to manipulate sun directions in real time and see results live, then dynamic is the way to go. But sorry, no, what I was saying before is once you bake and I move a certain object, it will ask me to rebake that particular object. And sometimes if you move a lot of assets, it will ask you to rebake them. Now there's tips and tricks. You can bake specific assets only. Does work, but again, kind of be quite cautious with that pipeline. It requires a lot of mesh optimization per se. So your vertices have to be aligned. Any breakages or gaps in the models, lighting may be able to leak through. So the pipeline of baked lighting as well does come with a lot of prerequisites, versus dynamic lighting doesn't really care that much because it's all done in real time. So it doesn't necessarily bake anything into a light map form. So you can get away with some breakages in your model much more than baked lighting. But again, it comes at a balance. Performance, packaging games, you really have to decide what the output is and then work your way backwards from there and what you can get away with. If your target hardware is, a beast computer, an NVIDIA graphics card, then you don't really have to worry about optimization. But if you're packaging games for mobile devices, then it's something that you're gonna need to consider. Milo has experience in that.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Pain and suffering.
That's my problem right now. I need to make a scene in a bit in Unreal, tomorrow that's going to have both baked and dynamic. So we'll see how that goes.
Good timing then, mate. Good timing. Lovely. Love it. Love to see it.
Amazing timing, man. Amazing timing. I needed this. A little refresher, bro.
My computer is a bit slow. Apologies. Where's my notes? Okay, there we go. Okay, so we covered baked versus static, and the performance endurance that may have. Correct UVs. Having correct UVs is super important. No breakages in the models. And there are some tweaks you can do in Unreal. But the beauty of Unreal is that you can work with almost any 3D software and go back and forth, and even work with some of this stuff real time. So you can adjust your models in your 3D software, watch it update live in Unreal, and see how those changes may affect some of the models in the scenes. So that's quite cool for a real time workflow. I guess to get started first, our Unreal Engine 5s are by default enabled Lumen, because they want obviously people to use it and test it more often. So in our project settings, under engine and rendering, is it? Where is it? Yes, under engine and rendering. So if your project settings are not open, go to window or edit project settings, pick that up, and under the render engine render settings, if you scroll down to global illumination and reflections, we've previously at some point towards the end of one of the workshops, we've set that to none, just to demonstrate the frame rate differentials there. But if you set that from none to Lumen, or see the options there, typically your project will come by default in Lumen. Now, like I said before, if you don't want to use Lumen or any, and by default just go for baked lighting, then I would suggest setting it to none. But because today we're going to work with a few Lumen parameters, let's just set that to Lumen. Now, once we do that, it will automatically prompt us to enable Lumen reflections as well. Now, we don't have to, but it just works well together. So bear that in mind. It will automatically ask you to do that, but you can change that back if you wanted to. And under reflections, there is a reflections captures resolution by default that's set to 128. So it goes 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1204, etc. So if your reflections in your scene are looking quite low res, I won't adjust this now because that starts to compile shaders. But if your reflections in your scene, so let's say you're working with some interior spaces, don't look quite right, you can adjust the reflection resolution right there. That will come very handy for you tomorrow. I know that's a tip. Tips. And if we scroll down the list now, I won't dive too much into detail of what hardware ray tracing does, but it's basically a feature of our graphics cards, either NVIDIA, AMD, whatever we have. Hardware ray tracing, I mean, the term pretty much explains it itself. It sends a bunch of rays and it fires back and gives us feedback to the camera. So, you know, if it's telling it what to render on the screen, so that can also help us save a bit on performance. So by default that may come turned off, turned on, I'm not quite sure, depending on the project template that you choose. Let's turn it on. Yeah, let's turn it on. It will ask us to reset the project, but it shouldn't ask, it shouldn't be too long. So enabling ray tracing, enabling skin cache, and we want it to store in the cache, so we say yes. And because we've enabled hardware ray tracing, it's going to prompt us to restart the engine, but it also enabled under Lumen this feature called use hardware ray tracing then available, and we're going to turn that on as well. Now, we're not going to go too much in detail of the ray lighting mode and translucency and reflections and software ray tracing mode. That's slightly more advanced, but I suggest looking into that if you're working with some interior spaces. They're quite handy. And I'll keep it there for now. We're just going to restart our engine. If you haven't saved, it's going to ask you to save, and we'll let that load. It's going to load back into the default map.
Yours is a lot quicker than mine.
Is it?
Yeah, I accidentally clicked restart now, like as soon as you showed that bit, and then it's been compiling since. It's on 5,000 now. It was on 7,000 before.
I didn't have to. Does anyone else have to recompile? No, I didn't have to recompile. Did you click anything else, buddy?
I think that, yeah, compiling shaders, 7,000, 45%.
Okay, me, you're good. You're back into the. All right, that's interesting. I guess we'll hold off there for a second. I should have known that may occurred. So it's just support hardware ray tracing and then use hardware ray tracing when available. Those two checkboxes, if you remember. Did you change the reflection resolution?
No, I didn't change anything. Literally just hardware ray tracing. That's it.
Okay.
Yeah, just the 2 buttons.
I didn't even get a chance to do the use hardware ray tracing when available yet.
Is it going to compile again?
Is it?
I hope not.
That might avoid the compile. Kat, what did you do? Did you just do support hardware tracing only, or both?
I did both buttons.
Okay.
And then the reflection capture is the same number, 128.
Interesting. Alright, so we've got two very different, and me and me are the same. That's weird. So.
And I thought my computer was fast, but it's still at 6,000.
Yeah, it takes a fair bit, but I'm on like 2,500 right now, so it gets faster, I think.
What's the percentage for you?
It's still at 45, but
Okay.
the number of compiled shaders gets significantly lower faster over time. So like the last 2,000 seems to be significantly smaller or easier for it to compile.
That's good. 5.5.
One thing to note, do not, and this I hate to say that on like a workshop session, but do not trust that percentage loading. It will go from 45 to maybe 72 and then to like 100 and then maybe stuck on 100 for a little bit. So it's quite frustrating that it doesn't update like it normally should, but typically it gets stuck on like 45 before it does stuff, and then it proceeds much faster. So after 45 it's just gonna jump.
Even UE4 had that. I remember. Yeah. That was very frustrating, yeah, because you have no idea. Like you think that it's frozen and all of a sudden it jumps.
That's why I always have Task Manager open on the other window on the side, just to see when it's like not responding or when it's using up the threads.
You gotta be informed. Yeah, you gotta know.
Okay, I guess for the next bit, you guys don't necessarily have to try. This is more for just a general understanding. But I believe we previously covered this before, where if you go to Windows and Environment Light Mixer, that brings up an interface with all our environment lights in. Now, when I mean environment lights, I mean the directional light, the exponential height fog, the sky atmosphere, the skylight, and the cloud, volumetric cloud. Those 5 components are the key components to what makes this beautiful looking sky in the current setup that we have now. So we're not using any HDRI, we're not using any other plugins. These are the default environment lights and sky atmosphere VFX that we're going to use going forward. So because we've created all of these, they don't appear here in the list, but if you create a blank project and you don't have anything in there, a blank level and it's just black. If you go to Windows and Environment Light Mixer, it will ask you to create all of these. I believe we covered that in an earlier tutorial. Now in here we can, see a lot of the components together, and we can adjust them together simultaneously. So we can change the light intensity from here to go from 10 to like 100. See what that does. I like to play around with the extremes just to see what all these numbers do originally, and then you start to tweak the in-betweens. If I want to change the light color, make it a little bit more orangey, depending on the style and the look I want to go for. It's a nice sunny day. Directional light will look at mainly those two components. If you are looking into designing, if you have rooms or caves or things in your environment or in your game that don't necessarily take directional light, so what I mean by that is, now this environment is openly covered, right? There's no roof, so the light is flowing in naturally. If we have a closed off room which is not receiving that light, we need to add what we call some indirect lighting, or sort of fake some lighting techniques in there to create a little bit of an ambiance. That's just something we have to do by default. So the indirect lighting intensity just basically contributes to, it's a multiplier to the global illumination to affect the amount of times it bounces in a space where there is no directional light. So as I said, it's in the indirect lighting. So usually for interior spaces, I have that sometimes to about between 5 and 10. Again, you can tweak that and see how it works. Right now, we won't really see a big difference in our open world, but feel free to explore that. Now, our skylight, this is where I want to go back to the documentation a little bit, is a skylight is really something that affects the way the lighting bounces in our environment. And by default, if we click on our skylight in the engine, we can see it's set to real-time capture. So what's happening now, it's every tick, every engine tick, it's getting a real-time snapshot of our environment lighting, and it's applying some multipliers on top of that. So it really helps with, like I said before, a bit of the indirect lighting. So here in this comparison in Unreal, and this is why I like Unreal's engine's documentation, is they have a lot of these sliders with the comparisons. You can actually see what's going on behind the hood. So here is directional light only. So if we just had the directional light, no skylight, and here is if we add some stationary skylight options. And stationary, I'll cover in a moment. We have static, stationary, movable, but as I scroll, you can see the difference of what that skylight bounce does to the environment, especially for interior spaces, like I said, not so much for outdoor spaces. So yeah, quite cool to play around with these techniques. Now, going back to the skylight, I guess we can see it here. Under the mobility section, we have currently set to movable, which is, if you hover over it, you can see what it says: totally dynamic, hold scene world dynamic shadows, slowest rendering. So really nice. That's what's the matter. If we go to stationary, we can see here, can't move, allows partially baked lighting and dynamic shadows for movable objects. So this is basically what we use if we want to go for an in-between of baked lighting and static lighting. And obviously static is the definition of fully baked lighting and fastest rendering, as it says here. So fully baked lighting, more FPS; movable lighting, less FPS. Straightforward. Static, in between, bit of a middle ground to find a bit of balance. Now our skylight, I'll leave it at real time, but feel free to explore some of the functions underneath, such as the resolution, the scale. Like, it very much acts like a directional light. It's got an intensity scale, it's got a light color, it's got an indirect light, and most of the times you'll use these together. You might reduce the intensity of the directional light and increase the intensity of the skylight just to give it more of that bounce. But typically, like I said, it's really an artistic form. Depending on your environment, it's going to require a bit of tweaking to get the light pretty much matched to the way you want it. So I would really start with, if you're working with lighting scenes, it's something professionals do in the industry, but it's really define that lighting scenario and the quality you're looking for quite early on, because that might give you a nice benchmark to work towards. I can't say how many hours I've spent just tweaking these values and not necessarily getting nowhere, but I didn't have something to match it to, and hence every time I opened the project I wasn't 100% satisfied. So it's always nice to have a visual reference of your lighting outputs. I'll close this and go on.
The landscape doesn't have a movable or static option. I'm guessing it's because it's always static. Is that right?
Yeah, landscape will. Good question. It's basically will use LODs for that. So landscapes will always use level of details for their static or dynamic lighting. So no matter what you do, it will always just take consideration. So if you bake the lighting, it will bake the lighting into LODs. If you use dynamic lighting, it will use dynamic lighting with LODs. That makes sense.
Perfect. Cool.
And that's defined. If you click on the landscape and you scroll down to LODs, you can see LOD distribution, lighting, etc. Resolution. You can by defining different LODs to the landscapes, you can decide which ones are baked and which ones are not. So you can go from a very far one which is baked to a more of a real-time one. As you get closer, you can play around and stuff like that. Cool. The other stuff that doesn't show up in our editor there, but if we click on exponential height fog, this is basically, as it says, doesn't really matter if it's movable, stationary. We can't really bake this. This is more of a VFX addition to the scene, but it controls the amount of fog in our scene. So playing around with the parameters, the fog density, 0 means 0 fog. Bringing it up increases the fog. Fog height fall off is the height distribution of that particular fog. If it's applying over the clouds. I don't know exactly what these numbers correlate to in terms of meters, centimeters, I don't know, 1/100th of a meter. That would be maybe some homework for you guys if you want to look into it. But it really affects the height in which the fog is applied. You can play with the fog opacity, fog colors, etc. Start distance, cut distance. This will be really useful if you're creating some nice outdoor scenes. You can get away with hiding stuff, as I've done recently. One of the projects we've done with me in an environment that the requirements were humongous. We've managed to get away, but with hiding the landscape around it, with adding a bit of fog and a bit of some visual effects that blend in nicely with the foreground. So this could be your trick to get away with stuff. Sky atmosphere, really, again, feel free to use the enable and disable buttons as well to see what contribution that adds to the scene. But as we enable it, you can see it adds our basically, as it says here, our first setting, it's our planet. It's Mother Earth. So anything that has to do with how far the stretch is, the horizon line, the colors of those horizons. If you're in Scandinavia, they're different to Cyprus and Korea, so these will differ depending on locations that you go to. And volumetric cloud, let's take a guess what that affects. So these look quite granular, especially around the edges. They look quite pixelated. There are some very nice tools and free to use plugins to get some really cool clouds. It does take a bit of work to get them nice and smooth, but it also goes with the cloud material. So if you get into material editing, deep dive into material editing, I suggest you look at this cloud material and start playing around with that to remove some of that pixelation, but also playing around with these parameters. Now, like I said, proceed with caution with these. I would highly recommend you enable your show FPS. So here in the burger, I've only recently started to use that. The burger icon, it's very American. The burger icon in the top left hand corner next to perspective, you have this show FPS, show stats checkboxes. I highly recommend enabling those, which will bring a little green FPS icon into your scene here. Just, you know, as you manipulate those and play around with the lighting, that will start to drop and increase depending on what you're doing. So I suggest once you get to the lighting stages, have that enabled or some sort of statistics to show you what's going on in your theme, because really this is where performance will be a hindrance. You can use stuff like, is it here, volumetric? No, it's another plugin that I have. I will dive into volumetric clouds, it's a bit more advanced. But yeah, those are our environment lights, as we call it, and visual effects. Now the environment lights are the skylight and directional light, and the VFX are the volumetric crowd, sky atmosphere, and exponential height fog. Now, one thing we're gonna add to this scene, which we don't have already, is something what we Unreal calls a post-process volume, a PPV, as short. So here in the plus icon with the cube, we can go to our volumes section here, and under volumes we have lots of different volumes. We're gonna look for P, post-process volume, and we're gonna click that. That will bring it by default into our scene. You can click it, drag and drop it, whatever you prefer. Now, this bugger is essentially a box that will affect a lot of our I'll give you context. So I was doing a project recently where I had to bake the lighting. Now this was a humongous project. I was going for 4K textures, real super realistic lighting, lots of reflections. It was insane. It took about 6 hours for the bake. Now, if the lighting didn't come out well in the bake, I would have to tweak it and rebake it, and that's another 6 hours. Now, that can be quite time consuming, especially if you've got certain deadlines. So having an understanding of where to use the post-process volume in balance with either lumen or baked lighting is really important, because you can, you know, bake the lighting to a certain point and then play around a little bit with those post-process effects. Now I'm not saying that, you know, you're gonna bake your lighting to the max, and you're gonna increase your lighting scale to like 1000, which is gonna blow your scene up, and then you're gonna reduce the exposure, let's say in your post-process volume or your gain. Let's say I wouldn't recommend that. It's using a balance with the two. So it's really there to add a layer of effects and complexity to the scene, but used in balance with the lighting. So don't take it for granted that it will fix your problems every time. So what I mean by that, if I click on this post-process volume, currently it is a box. So the post-process works is whenever you're inside it, it will take effect. If you're outside it, it won't take effect. Now, environments might have lots of these post-process volumes, you know, depending on what you're doing in your game. I have some separate ones for exteriors and interiors for different shots, so they come in handy. But usually, if you search in the post-process details, infinite or extend, it will allow you to have this checkbox, which if you click it, it will enable for the whole environment. So once you click that, you'll get the whole post-process volume applied to your whole level in an environment. So if you uncheck that, then it only works when you're inside post-process volume. So be conscious of that. Why is it not taking effect? Or if you want to do it, if you want to be safe, I would maybe recommend scaling it as well if you want. So if you have a specific area that you're focusing, just scale it to that area so that you know it can take effect in the whole world, but you're also taking effect in here. Now the post-process volume is a little bit intermediate and towards advanced. It's quite good to know that it exists, so I just wanted to introduce it a little bit and show you maybe something like the exposure level. So let me check here in the okay, we've got auto exposure enabled. So what auto exposure is, basically our editor is acting like a camera at the moment. So it's the camera's got different, like our eyes, it's got different exposure levels. So if we were in a very dark area and we moved to a very lit area, it takes our eyes a bit of time to adjust. So it's trying to apply the same approach a little bit in the engine. Now we can play with those parameters a little bit, so we can define how much of that exposure is adjusted, whether it's quick. Depends if you're doing some nice camera shots, you want that to happen quite rapid, or you want to completely remove it, in my opinion. But again, depends on what you do. You might want to set different values to that. So currently if I enable it, it's on auto exposure and our compensation is set to 1. Now if I start to reduce that, you can see that's taken effect to the global lighting of the scene. So this is where I was talking about earlier about maybe a cave environment or an interior room. If you're going for an exterior place to an interior room, you might want to have different post-process volumes for that, because your exposure levels might be different outside than inside. You want to get a balance of both, but sometimes you probably want to adjust this. And the ranges of how it applies, there's a exposure is one thing I commonly use with the post-process volume, so that's why I wanted to bring it up. But feel free to explore all the other settings. It's basically insane what you can do with this. You can add color grading, like saturation to your scene, if you're creating some cool games, or want to showcase your point cloud data, quite cool. With different parameters, you can change shadows, midtones, highlights, the way your camera acts, global illumination settings. So if you really want to boost, if you really want to make your graphics card cry, I suggest you look at global illumination settings in the post-process volume. They will really take an impact, and I'll show you. For instance, if I check this lumen scene lighting quality, I'm now at 35-40 fps. If I make that 40, I'm now at like 10, barely 10 to 20 fps. So that has a crazy impact on the lighting. But if you've got good graphics cards, I suggest to go crazy. Proceed with caution, please. This may crash your graphics cards sometimes, so start with fewer variables. These particular variables, don't do the extremes. Other variables, yes, play with the extremes for sure, like the midtones and the contrasts and effects and whatnot, just not with the lumen, global illumination, and the reflection settings. Try and tweak it value by value and try and see if you actually notice the difference, because those 1 to 2 or 3 to 4 really have an impact on the performance of the scene. So don't say I didn't warn you. Cool. Sorry, I'm blabbering a lot here. Any questions? I'm just going through the list here, but this is more of a it's hard to give you. I'll give you my approach. A lot of videos you'll see will have their own approach. A lot of artists, approach this lighting techniques very differently with different backgrounds. Mine is very broad, it's very technical. So I just focus on the parameters that I know to work with, and leave the rest. Typically, at this stage, I would pass this to someone that really knows what they're doing, if the budget allows. But it's really an artistic form, the lighting. So people will have their own ways of doing it. Just take it with a pinch of salt, try it yourself, see what works for you, see what doesn't, and proceed that way. okay, that's environment lights. We've gone over static versus stationary versus movable. Now we're not gonna bake our lighting because that can take a bit of time, and currently we're just set to dynamic lighting. But if you want to know where it is in the engine, if you go to build up top, you have a button here, lighting, which is set to build lighting only, and below it you have a lighting quality checkbox. So I recommend understanding what these do, these different quality levels. So if I was starting off with a scene, very basic, very entry level, I would do a quick preview bake lighting, so that's the lowest of the qualities. And as I ramp up in scale, and obviously before I do a final build or a final render, whatever it may be, I will do a production lighting, because that's the final step and that's what takes the longest of the time. Now, build lighting, I want to mention specifically, works with Unreal's default lighting works with CPU. So if you have good RAM, I suggest, if you're doing any baked lighting, to have 32 at least. It saves a lot of time, and also if you're doing any rendering as well. So 16 will work, but it will be quite slow. So I highly recommend 32 RAM, and it's CPU based as well. Now there is a GPU lighting plugin that you can enable if you want to do your baked lighting on the GPU instead of your CPU, if your GPU is better. But that does have its downfalls as well, so you won't get the same baked lighting. I've seen some rumors about the clouds and their pixels and the GPU lighting not presenting a much more quality on the CPU. So the CPU, the default, is the better one. Personally, you will hear other opinions, so feel free to explore what works for you as well in that respect. Now, this lighting quality is quite important, so bear that in mind. And last but not least, what makes our lighting builds a lot longer is the resolution of our objects. So I don't know here if we have any objects. We go third person. We've got a landscape. Filter by static mesh. What do we got here? Alright, got a little rock. Where did that come from? Cool, got a little cliff. I'll bring this cliff in so we can see a little bit what I mean by the resolution of the objects. That's a big rock. That's a granite rock probably. Cool, so we can see it's already quite high res, but we haven't really baked the lighting, so we can't really see the effects of it immediately. But if I search under this object light map, it automatically comes up with this light map resolution. So what I said earlier about what happens when you bake lighting is Unreal Engine will take all the static meshes in your on your level, your landscapes, your trees, whatever you have. It will take the UVs of each one of those objects and compile it all into a file, broken down into multiple files, compressed multiple files that will consolidate of your baked lighting of your environment. Now, the resolution of those meshes is what will impact that lighting time. Now, if objects are receiving a lot of light, so if you're working with, let's say, interior spaces, and you're lighting the scene quite well, especially interior ones, then floors and walls as such will have a much higher resolution because they're receiving a lot more light, and you want that light to bounce and receive evenly on the surfaces. Whereas stuff that's in the background, maybe a book or a bookshelf or a lamp, something that's just sitting there as an object, might not require that much lighting visibility, then you might look to lower that resolution of that mesh. So again, most of it by default will be coming in at 64, but higher objects that will receive more lighting, I suggest looking at values of 512 or 124 as well. Now, as I adjust this, like I said, you won't really see it being apparent now in the scene, but make a note of it, because as you start building lighting and you start changing these resolutions, you will start to see the impact. Now, what I would recommend is to not go too crazy with these. So start with a low resolution, bake the lighting in like a medium scenario, see what that gives you. You know, obviously if you build to a production quality, that is something you're gonna have to predict that will get better. So if it doesn't look quite right in the medium quality, it might not necessarily be that you need to up the resolution. You'll just do the production, which will be much better. So you'll see that as you use it, basically. So general rule of thumb, you know, it's all in intervals of powers of 2. So 1, 2, 4, like I said, 8, 16, 32. So keep that in mind, 64. You don't want to go below 64, as the default is 64, because then the lighting will look completely terrible if you bake it. But not so much of an impact if you're doing dynamic lighting. So if you're doing dynamic real time, I wouldn't be concerned about that too much, because we're not necessarily baking. If you are doing a mixture of both, then that is something that some of your objects will have. Some of your objects will have higher density, some of them will not have, some of them will have a lower density. Cool. Lovely stuff. Lots to go on at lighting. This should be like a 6-week tutorial just on its own, but I'm trying to compress it into an hour, so apologies if it's all coming a bit much, but I think we covered a bit of the basic lights in the beginning stages, like point lights and spotlights and stationary lights. I'm happy to go over that again if you missed that or want to see a little bit of that as well.
Do you mean like some of their settings, the way that you just basically set them up as stationary or static or movable? You mean?
Yeah, basically stuff like that. There's not much else. I mean, to start with, I would recommend looking at those. I wouldn't go into much detail. You know, when you're using different lights, the main these now we're going into more of our scene lights. So you have environment lights, and then you have scene lights. If you have multiple of these lights and you want to create lots and lots of different lights, I suggest you use the light mixer. So same as the environment light mixer, we also have a scene light mixer. So instead of using environment light mixer, we're going to use light mixer. Now I appreciate the two might be a little bit confusing, but under window, jump to light mixer, and in here it's going to bring a window of all the lights in the scene. Now I know direction light is in there, so it's a bit confusing, but you know, if you multiply all these lights in your scene, you create lots of them, they will start to appear here, so they're easier to manage in this light mixer than looking for them in the browsers themselves. And here you can shift select and manipulate them all at the same time.
Does that include materials that are lit on objects or not?
No, not emissive materials on objects.
Okay.
Emissive one is quite a useful one if you're going for lumen, so we can have another session on that if you want. I appreciate you might need some of that tomorrow, so feel free to give me a shout. I'll be online, man.
Cool.
If you
Thanks,
have any
man.
questions.
Appreciate it.
But emissive materials can be quite handy. They are very low on performance and very useful in certain scenarios, especially if yeah.
I was going to say, presuming that you make everything in a scene static, right, including the lighting, and then you build the lighting, that would be entirely baked. And then I set, let's say, a random object to be a movable object set up in the light that's movable. That would then be the dynamic light. And then in theory, the scene would be a mixed lighting setup, or would there be other sort of things that I would need to consider?
You need to consider enabling dynamic lighting on your static objects. So even though the lighting would be baked, when you move that lamp, you want the shadows to adjust in real time, right? So you need to set the shadows of those objects to be dynamic. so that they can receive shadows from a dynamic light. Otherwise, it's all going to be baked, and when you move that light, nothing's going to change in your scene.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Now, because I think in this particular use case, it actually might be helpful to not have any of the real-time lights actually influence the environment, because it kind of just needs to look very dark. But I guess I'll see. I'll experiment and see what works.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I don't recommend using the environment lights all the time. I mean, it's really a scenario basis. If you want to get, like, if you're doing something and you just want to looking out the window kind of thing, and you just want something in there in the background, I would go for the HDR backdrop. You set that as a sphere in your volume, and that's your background image. So if you look out the window, it's going to be a little bit blurry on the outset, so you can get away with like a fake outdoor environment if you're not really going outside.
I think in this case, it's just going to be like inside a theater hall kind of situation.
Yeah, just
so
all you'll be doing is point lights and
point lights everywhere. Yeah,
point lights and basically the default rectangular lights and spotlights as well, for sure. Yeah, I wouldn't do any environment lights. Definitely post-process volume, but maybe no environment lights.
Okay. Nice. Thanks, man. Appreciate it, bro.
Good. So I guess the lights themselves, the components that they have, that it's quite interesting to look at. So all of them the same. And anyone you choose, point light, spotlight, rec light, they all have the same, similar, and all the same parameters. Intensity, units. Have a look into it if you're interested. This can be quite advanced. You can actually get an accurate spotlight profile. So when you create spotlights in your environment, you're using exactly the same profile as what the lamp in your room might be. So you can get that information exactly and match it in Unreal, so you can do some pretty accurate lighting scenarios. Attenuation radius is how far that lighting takes effect, so this little sphere around it. Source radius, soft radius, a bit more advanced, but that's basically the size of the bulb. If I was to be quite literal, this is essentially the size of your bulb inside your light fixture. And temperature, again, affects pretty much like the light color. If you change that, I just meant to do the attenuation radius. If you change the temperature of that, higher you go is colder, the lower you go it's warmer. Now our environment is quite lit, so you can't see the difference of that. Bring that back down. You see the auto exposure getting to play. I really dislike this auto exposure personally, so I recommend disabling it. It's hard to work with in the lighting scenarios. But you can see as I bring this temperature value down and up, it's changing the lighting temperature on the floor. So that's quite a neat thing to look at. And like our directional light, it also has indirect lighting intensity. So for you, Milo, instead of adjusting your indirect lighting intensity of your directional light, because you're working with interior spaces, you will be looking at the indirect lighting intensity for each of your point lights. Now, because each of your point lights will have a value themselves, they will accumulate over the scene. So that will basically mean that depending on your influence radius, that will impact your indirect light. And obviously if you have 20 lights, you don't want to have this set too high. Whereas if I had one directional light for my exterior space, for my landscape, I can set this to something like 20 and 10. But if I was to set the same value of 20 and 20 to all of my spotlights in my scene, that will just create some chaos of lighting in the environment and some unnatural bouncing of light. So keep those values low for lots and lots of lights. If you're doing one point light just to create a bit of emission in your room, a bit of ambience, you can set that higher and make it act like a directional light, but keep that relatively low for lots of lights.
Nice, man. Thanks. That's really helpful.
No problems. Yeah, guys, sorry I can speak for weeks and weeks on this. I've left some breathing room, towards the end of the last two tutorials, so we can go a bit more into lighting scenarios and techniques, because it's quite an advanced it's quite an elongated workshop itself. So feel free to come up with more questions and try some stuff out. If you're not unsure, like always, drop a message in the Discord. This is like I said, an area of exploration. So if stuff is not happening quite working out how you expect it to be, then I would understand if you've got questions. Literally is the one thing I have open on Reddit all the time. But yeah, just to wrap it up, any more questions up to this point?
I feel like I'll have more tomorrow.
Lovely. Share it in the chat. I realized we didn't go over what we learned last week at the intro of this workshop, but it's too late. Bit too late now. Maybe we'll cover it in the next one, as we're doing packaged games. And our next workshop is, like I said, packaging and building our games, or deploying it to executable for desktop or Linux or iOS, whatever the output platform is. And so we'll be covering a little bit more on our blueprints that we created and worked with last week's workshop. So don't be afraid, we'll catch up on that. Building and packaging is quite much like rendering. It doesn't take the same amount of time, but it does take a bit of time. So I'll do a bit of a pre-test to see how long the build process will take for something small like this, and whether we have time to actually build it during the workshop. But if not, we'll get to the point where we can build it, and we'll build it, let it build overnight or something, and then we'll catch up on the next workshop and see it packaged and stuff. Okay. Well, I'm gonna stop the recording right here. Thank you, everybody.